what we read.
That's right. We've been reading.
We've been reading
thanks to my brand new Kindle Unlimited. Like, there's so many Unlimiteds that I subscribe to now. Lots of digital stuff. And we'll have some of that today. Maybe you'd like to kick things off.
I'm going to talk about all the ones that I don't actually own first. So it's going to be a lot of stuff that I read digitally. So first we have Of Curses and Kisses by Sandhya Menon, which I got via NetGalley thanks to Simon & Schuster. So Of Curses and Kisses is basically Sandhya Menon's modern day fairy tale retelling set at a boarding school. It's the beginning of a companion novel series, and the first story is based on Beauty and the Beast. It is about a princess of India named Jaya, and she goes to this school because she wants to ruin the life of Grey, who is the Beast character in the story, because she thinks that he is the one who did some shady stuff that had her sister's face splashed all over the tabloids. So that's essentially the beginning of the story, and the two of them sort of form a relationship and get to know each other over the course of the novel. I really liked the Beauty and the Beast details that were woven into the story. They were done in a fun way that sort of reminded me of a Disney Channel original movie.
Okay.
So I think actually this would translate really well into a visual medium, and it would be fun in that format. I also really liked a lot of the secondary characters, including Jaya's sister for one, and a lot of Grey's friends. I think they were really interesting. And of course, I really had a soft spot for Grey because he's kind of the grumpy loner type with a good heart, you know, my usual type. The frustrating thing about this story, I think, for me is Jaya and her motivations. It felt a little weak to me, and I feel like I would have enjoyed it more maybe when I had read less when I was a little younger, which, to be fair, it is meant to be for a teenager, so understandably, this would probably appeal to a lot of other people who aren't me. I really found a lot of the choices she made and the behavior she exhibited really exasperating, and it was kind of hard sometimes to read because you just wanted to shake her so that you could shake some sense into her. So that definitely affected my personal enjoyment. I still thought it was a pretty fun take on this whole Beauty and the Beast story, and depending on who the main character is in the second book, that would pretty much decide whether or not I keep on going with the series.
Right.
For me, more of a borrow, but if the premise sounds much more up your alley, then maybe you'll want to consider putting a pre-order in for that one. Another book that I read is one that I borrowed from Scribd. I actually listened to the audiobook of this, and it's Naked in Death by J.D. Robb. So the main character in this one is a detective named Eve Dallas, and she's really good at her job. She's really good at investigating. And so she's put as the primary investigator into this big murder case for a senator's daughter. And so the entire book is her investigation into that, including the investigation into a family friend named Rourke, who is this very successful Irish businessman who had dealings with that family. It's a really interesting mystery, and I think I maybe found it really interesting because I don't read a lot of that genre. That's really not my usual, that is not my usual type of read. And I read it because I'm doing Romanceopoly this year, and it was a good option for the spot I had landed on. I definitely find it hard too because it's a serial killer mystery, and I normally don't go for those because that is something that freaks me the heck out. It's hard to actually say that I enjoyed it because of course it's difficult to read about a story that has so much assault and violence and degradation and all of that stuff. That's hard to say that you enjoyed it, but I really think that the mystery was interesting enough to keep me hooked, and I really wanted to know how it was all going to turn out at the end.
Just enough to figure it out.
Plus, I think the main character is just so spunky and smart, and I just liked her personality a lot, so I really enjoyed that too. Following her narration was also a big highlight for me. So I'm glad I did check it out, although I would say for me, again, more of a borrow than a buy. That series is long. It's almost 50 books long. So I don't know if I'll be continuing. We'll see, because again, not my usual cup of tea, but I'm glad it turned out pretty well for something that I just tried on a whim.
Fair.
Speaking of things I tried on a whim, there is another book that I also read because of Romanceopoly, and it is a book called The Magpie Lord, which is by KJ Charles. So this book has two main characters. There is Lucien Vaudry, who has returned from being in Shanghai for years and years to take over his family's estate. And he crosses paths with a magician named Stephen Day because it seems that someone has cursed his family so that they all die. Oh. And so obviously he doesn't want to die, and Stephen agrees to help even though he and his family have their own personal grievances against Lucien's family. This one was actually pretty okay. I thought the lore was good, it was solid, because it was an interesting thing where it was a historical fiction story, but there was magic interwoven into London society, and that's always fascinating to me. And I think the characters Lucien and Stephen are both quite fun to read about. Stephen's this magician who's also a detective, basically. He is part of a group of people that manages magicians and tries to make sure no one you know, does bad magic. And then there's Lucian, who's kind of like the devil-may-care character who comes back and is literally just, he's very roguish, basically. So I did like it while I was reading it, but ultimately I don't think it's one that's going to sit with me well forever. Again, more of a borrow than a buy, which is pretty much the trend in this video. And the last one, which I also borrowed, this time from the New York Public Library, is Surprise Me by Sophie Kinsella. And this one is about Sylvie and Dan. They're a married couple who have been married, I think, for like 4 or 5 years. They both go for like an annual checkup at the doctor's, and the doctor tells them that they're actually going to live longer than most people's life expectancies, and so they're gonna have close to 70 more years of marriage. And it kind of freaks them both out. For them, they didn't imagine that forever would mean that long. They didn't actually have a concrete idea what that meant, but like in their minds it wasn't going to be that long. And so they're struggling to figure out, like, the first part of the book is them struggling to figure out how they can manage to keep their relationship like thriving and surviving and alive for that long. Sylvie comes up with a couple of ideas, but the one that sticks is that they're going to plan surprises for each other and like do things like that because they have so long to live. But the second half of the book actually takes a turn because there is a huge surprise for Sylvie that is not one that is part of Dan's surprises that he planned for her, but it just so happens that their life circumstances, things she didn't know about, are obviously a surprise. I will say that I definitely like the premise of this one more than the other Sophie Kinsella that I had tried to read right before it, which I ended up DNFing. I think it's an interesting idea to explore their reactions to this whole being married and being together for so long. It's funny because I told Mackie and Kristen both that like my immediate response to this was like, I would love to have the extra time with Mackie. Like no doubt in my mind. In my mind I'd be like, it's great. That means more time with Mackie. Cool. Yeah. So it kind of didn't sit well with me at first that they were both kind of like,
it's like, what, did you expect to die? Like, was it a bummer that you weren't gonna die? Was that the only escape? I mean, it was a little strange to me too.
The first part to me was a little bit rough to read just because it felt a little clunky, even though it still had some really good comedy gold because it's a Sophie Kinsella book and she does those pretty well. The second part got a little bit TV soap opera drama levels. So I wasn't expecting that, and it was still super compelling to me to read because I wanted to find out how it was gonna conclude. But I feel like it was reading almost like reading two different stories, really, which kind of like made the book suffer overall in my opinion. So again, more of a borrow than a buy. I'm not mad I read it, but I also like it definitely does not hit my top like titles from Sophie Kinsella list. So
alrighty,
I think it's your turn now.
My turn. I actually read a couple of Fables spin-offs. Now, for those of you who don't know, Fables is it's like an Eisner Award-winning graphic novel series written by Bill Willingham. Fables stars pretty much every single fable ever, every kind of fairy story, every kind of fairy tale. Think of a mythology where, in different sort of dimensions in other lands, there are fables that we human beings sort of created and dreamt up, and the strength of those fables and stories and how long they endure will pretty much dictate how powerful these fables are, right? They are driven out of the fable homelands into the mundane world, the Mundi, which is where we live, and have decided to create their own little kind of state there. They have some place in New York, and I wasn't even living in New York at the time, and never thought in a million years I would be living in New York. But they set up shop here, and then for the fables who can't pass for human, they have established like outside of New York, like the farm. That's where pretty much that is. It spanned about like 50 trade paperbacks. It was plus. It was a huge deal. Spanned several years of storytelling. Very, very cool. Characters like Snow White and the Big Bad Wolf, and there were even TV series and video games, etc. So to take that entire mythology from Bill Willingham and play in it, I think worked extremely well for these two titles that we're going to talk about. So the first one I want to really sort of focus on would be the Cinderella spin-off, where of the fables, Cinderella has two sort of like trade paperbacks to her name. The first one being called From Fable Town with Love, and then the second one being Fables Are Forever. Now, in the stories, fables obviously have lived such crazy lives, having spanned several lifetimes on Earth. They're nigh immortal, right? Some of them are downright unkillable just because their fables are so well known. Cinderella, of course, being an extremely popular one. By day, and as far as everyone in Fabletown is concerned, she owns a shoe store. Not surprised. However, flip that narrative on its ear and flash back to like the 18th century when Cindy first comes to Fabletown. She actually gets recruited by the sheriff to be Fabletown's spy. So she runs a shoe store by day, but in reality she's actually going around the world and sometimes even back to the homelands on special missions from Fabletown, which is what their kind of sovereign state is. So it's a spy film basically. It's spies and espionage, and it's basically like if James Bond were Cinderella. And what with the sordid past and the prince, and then, by the way, there's only one Prince Charming, and he has pretty much like screwed Cindy and Snow and a bunch of these girls over. I don't know that. Yeah, it's one of those things. So it was really, really great. Highly recommend this series to, and first of all, anybody who loves Fables. Now, do I recommend that you read this before you read all 50 Fables books? Probably not, because a lot of the flavor of why this works is because you've sort of fallen in love with the world already, and I don't know that it's as easy to slip into this as you sort of feel like your gateway drug into the larger Fables world.
Okay.
So there is that. So it's really just more sort of like a companion thing that I don't know you'll benefit from it by, you know, in terms of loving the entire series.
Okay.
The Cinderella stories take place sort of in the middle of the 50-book Fable sort of series. This next spin-off called Ever After is right after. It's kind of like a
So you definitely have to have read
it's definitely like an epilogue. You can definitely jump into it, but then I feel like the experience of jumping into this after not having read the entire Fable series for a very long time, though I did haul it once and say that we have everything.
I know, I'm just anticipating the day I can get to it.
Now we should have the great Kindle trade up. You get to read my Kindle with all the Fable stuff.
Maybe we'll do that for 1 month. We'll just trade.
Yeah, we should do that. That's kind of a thing. I'll read all of the Sarah J. Maas stuff. You read Fables, which is roughly as voluminous.
Fables and Saga, because I think you have Saga too.
I do have Saga. Oh, that's something we both should read. In any case, and Avatar. But in any case, Ever After is set right after Fables with the next generation of kids. So there are some people here who sort of spawned, and then one of the main characters
sort of spawned.
Yeah, sort of spawned, and the spawn have caught up with some of the earlier sort of characters already because they're kind of nigh immortal, so they will be youthful and fine while everybody else grows up around them. It's set in a post-Fables finale world, which is insane. No spoilers there, but it's definitely a new world. The events of Fables have changed the very face of reality. This next generation is just trying to figure out, well, where do they fit in? And it's spies again. It's kind of like a secret organization, kind of like a secret society of hit squad Fables that sort of make sure that they keep the peace. Fables actually took a very interesting trope throughout the entire thing. So if you imagine the Fables as a sovereign state, meaning they're like a country of Fables. They're not like, there's no species like them. They're Fables, all of them. And they have to do things for their survival, not just to survive the human world, but to survive whatever drove them out of the homelands. So they need to create some kind of like crack team that works in the shadows. Is so cool. It's like a story within a story. And so I guess they took those, and that's what they spun off, because those were easily one of the best parts, at the very least, of the entire sort of narrative. So definitely recommend the series. Definitely do not recommend jumping straight into this, because you will be spoiled magnificently. So stay away until you've read them. But then when you've read them, please do grab them. It's just so good.
Actually, the next book I'm going to talk about, I read with my friends DJ and Kristen and Rachel. It is our first read for our paranormal book club this year, and that, for me, was a reread, and it is For Beautiful Creatures, which is by Kemi Garcia and Margaret Stoll. So I read this years ago, like way before I started the blog, way before I got on Goodreads, and I remember I had really liked it, but I never continued the series. So when I reread it, I kind of had an idea of what was going to happen. I remembered most of the major things, but it was still really nice to dive back into this story and this lore. So it is centered around a main character named Ethan. It's funny because I actually forgot that he's the main narrator and not the girl character who is named Lena. So Ethan has been having dreams of this girl, and it is the only thing really that his mind fixates on as an escape, aside from books, and he has always wanted to leave his small town home of Gatlin, up until the day that the girl from his dreams shows up at their school. And his life and...
Quite literally the girl of his dreams.
His life and Lena's get very intertwined, mostly out of a mutual fascination for one another, but it turns out there's actually more to their connection than either of them realize. And shenanigans ensue, which is usually my favorite.
Paranormal shenanigans, yes.
So, I actually really enjoyed this. It was fun revisiting it because I'd forgotten how interesting the lore of this world is.
The lore is great, actually.
It's super simple, but it's also really effectively done. And it's definitely more like an old school paranormal, like YA type read, sure. But I think it was still really fun. What I found most interesting is that I normally don't read a lot of YA books, YA specifically paranormal, almost romance books, that are from the perspective of the guy only. Like, Lena has
that is special, isn't it?
Lena has no perspective here, and it's kind of funny because Ethan is the one who's doing the pining in this one, and he's kind of the clueless one too, so it was sort of a weird subversion of what I'd normally encounter in these kinds of stories.
And so ahead of its time in that sense.
Yeah, it was really enjoyable. It's a really long book, which I totally forgot, but I had a lot of fun reading it, and I still do want to continue and finish the series because I want to know how it ends. So it was really fun. I'm glad I finally read it. I don't know if this will make me feel better about watching the movie because the others still want to do that, and my face is just like,
hey,
I don't really care for the movie, even though the cast was like
movie
great.
Ethan eventually becomes Han Solo,
Yeah, but
and
that's an
Jeremy Irons.
eventuality. The next book I'm going to talk about is an ARC that I got from the author, so I'm very grateful to Tiff for sending this to me. It is Once Upon a Sunset, which is her upcoming women's fiction novel. Well, I don't know if it'll be upcoming by the time this video goes up, but it's coming out on March 10th. I want to say. Anyway, Once Upon a Sunset actually alternates between two perspectives. There is Diana and her mother Margot. And so Diana at the beginning of the book is a OB-GYN that works for, you know, a very well-known hospital, and she makes a decision that sort of gets questioned and she's put on probation. This actually comes at the perfect time because her mother, in an effort to clean out what it remains of Diana's grandmother's, Margot's mother's stuff, discovers a series of letters from her father, who is apparently, or was apparently, still alive in the Philippines. And so they end up going to the Philippines to try to like figure out this whole situation with their relatives that they apparently did not know existed, and try to find out more about their father's story. And I thought it was a really good story. I didn't actually end up loving it as much as I thought I was going to, but I thought it had a really compelling premise and driving force, and I liked that a lot of it was set in the Philippines and that it involved like sort of an exploration of familial structure in the Philippines and familial history in that sense. So that part was the part that really hooked me in the end, because I found a lot of it really relatable, especially the extended family stuff. Like in my mind I was like, that would totally happen, or that would be a thing. I think this time, because my mind was prepared to not really consider the romantic aspect, like the romance of it, because I expected that with her other book, which is why I felt a little let down. It actually didn't end up affecting my reading at all this time because I knew that going in. I will say that I am not so much a fan of one of the romances, but Diana's romance in particular. But anyway, it was still a pretty good read if you're looking for more like a women's fiction story that explores familial ties, and very specifically it's more like Filipino and Filipino-American familial ties, then you might want to check this one out as well.
Cool.
The next book I'm going to talk about is Incendiary by Zoraida Cordova, which is out in April. I think it's April 28th. I can't actually remember the date it comes out. Anyway, this is a fantasy series starter. It is about Renata Convida, who is a memory thief, basically. And she was used by the king as sort of a weapon and has taken lots and lots and lots of memories from a lot of people. She's finally made her escape, and she's working with the rebels. And they have this big master plan that is supposed to help them sort of gain the upper hand. But it all kind of falls apart when the main person handling that plan, his name is Des, and she's actually sort of got a relationship with him, he gets taken. And so Renata decides that she is going to take his place in the plan and also try to rescue him, so she infiltrates the palace again. But while she's there, she uncovers more about what really is going down in that kingdom. I'm a little 50-50 on this one, to be honest. Like, it is very much a series starter because there is a lot of like setup that needs to happen for you to understand like the sort of the magical hierarchy and the political structure of the world, and it felt a little bit more typical of like the YA fantasies that I've read. So that part I kind of like struggled with at the beginning, and I guessed a lot actually of the plot too, because I felt like it was following the usual like, you know, YA setup that it would normally follow. But I did enjoy the last like 100 pages or so. That's when all of like the big climactic events start happening and like the big revelations come out, and that really ended up hooking me more than I expected it to, even though I guessed at one or two of them. The fact of the matter is, for me with like series starters, it tends to come down to two things. Did I like it enough to finish the book? Was there something enough that dragged me through it? And would I continue the series? At this point, I'm actually interested in seeing how Incendiary goes on. I'm not sure if it's a trilogy, duology, whatever it is, but I am curious about book 2, especially after how it ends. So this one I'll probably be checking out the rest of.
Cool.
I also read another series starter. This one is an adult fantasy series starter. It is The Wolf of Oreñaro by K.S. Villoso. She is a Filipino author, and a lot of the cultural details, even though they're not actually named in Filipino terms, a lot of them are actually quite recognizable, especially the food, which, you know, that part was always interesting. This is the story of Queen Talien. She has been ruling on her own for like, I think 4 years at this point, because her husband suddenly up and went after their wedding night. Like, for no reason at all, he just up and went and left her and her son there. And so she's been ruling on her own, but then she gets a letter from him, and she decides that she's gonna go to where he is and try to convince him to come back with her. both for her son's sake and for their kingdom's sake. But when she gets to their destination and they have their meeting, it turns out that somebody else has been plotting their assassination.
Oh, wow.
Which then results in her trying to figure out how to protect herself, protect her kingdom, and also what is really going on with her husband. I will say that the writing style of this one is not necessarily my perfect cup of tea. Like, I have a preferred fantasy storytelling style, so in this case this wasn't necessarily like what I would usually go for. Once I got invested in Talienne as a character, I love that she's basically like she has her own mind and she's gonna follow what she wants to do most of the time. Fair. That was the part where I started feeling like I really wanted to know what would happen next. I will say the narration style was not what I expected either, because it's her telling the story to the reader, so it's basically, I didn't really feel too worried for her future because she's telling it from the future, if that makes sense.
Right, I mean, yeah.
So like anytime she was in like a life or death situation, I'm like, she's gonna live because she's telling me the story, so there's no way she's
unless she's been telling it from Hades.
I know, right? Unless it's like she's a ghost and she's telling me the story. I don't know. Again, same thing with the other one. The real question is, would I continue reading the series? And as of this moment, the answer is actually yes. So there's that one. Okay, the next book I have to talk about is The Honey Don't List by Christina Lauren. This is their latest women's fiction contemporary romance offering, and it is basically if you crossed Chip and Joanna Gaines' story, they're like a home improvement couple, right? And you cross that with the movie Set It Up on Netflix. So in this story, the two main characters are Carrie and James, and they're assistants to this couple, Melissa and Rusty Tripp, who have a home improvement type show. The assistants are set to the task of wrangling both of these people because they actually are not like the happy couple you see on screen. They're more like antagonistic enemies that are doing everything deliberately to push each other's buttons. It's because they have very different outlooks on what they want from life now. And so it's up to Carrie and James to try to manage them during their book tour. I think it was a really cute setup. It definitely read like a romantic comedy, which was a lot of fun. And I like the whole idea of these two assistants like on a book tour trying to like manage people but also kind of falling in love with each other at the same time. That was really interesting to me. And I liked Carrie a lot and I liked James a lot. I did not expect that it was gonna get really serious at certain points. That was not something I had expected going into it, and I think I can't speak to how it was presented in the book, but it felt really authentic to me and it really worked. I do think the resolution was a little too quick in the end, but that's just my opinion. I still had a really fun time reading it. This one for me, among their titles, again, more of a borrow than a buy, so this video literally has a theme. The last book I'm finally going to talk about in this video is also a series starter, and that is HalfBlood by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and this is the first book in her Covenant series. So this is about a teen named Alexandria, and after her mother is murdered, she finds herself returning to a place called the Covenant. The Covenant is where she grew up because Alexandria is actually a hematoi, which means that she is a child of God. She is only a half-blood, however, and not a pure-blood. And half-bloods only have two possible career paths at this point. They can either be indentured servants, so basically slaves, or they can serve as sentinels, who are basically like kick-ass bodyguards for the pure-bloods. And so Alex, because she has a fighting spirit, wants to be a sentinel, also to avenge her mother's death. This entire book is her journey to prove that she is worthy of staying at the Covenant after being away for 3 years with her mom. And to do so, she has to train under a current sentinel named Aiden. Other than that, there's a bunch of other things that go on, but I will leave it there. This is a very entertaining series starter, even though I felt like it was very, very similar to a lot of things, specifically the Percy Jackson series and the Vampire Academy series. I still had a lot of fun reading it, even though I pretty much guessed at every single thing. I think that's my own damn fault for reading it so late, you know? Like, it's been out for years. But also I think it's because that's just the way my mind works. Like, I'm easily able to put pieces together, and I don't think they were very hidden from the reader. Like, they're all just right there, so it's kind of fairly like,
yeah, I mean, this is what's patterns within patterns. I
will say that I really enjoyed Alex as a main character. She does come across a little young sometimes, especially at the beginning of the book, but she's also kind of the headstrong, like reckless kind of female that I really enjoy. However, the two other characters in this book that I really enjoy are two guys in the story, and they're both very much my type, but in different ways. And I've told Rachel this, and I think I told Mackie this while I was reading it, like, it was almost as if, like, someone had been in my brain and been like, what kind of archetype is this person like? They're both in this book.
Yep.
Specifically the captain of the guard type and the rogue type, both in here. So that was really enjoyable for me, and I had a lot of fun reading it. Whenever I picked it up, I just like flew through pages, but it was also not the type of story that I felt the need to immediately return to it when I put it down. So, little 50-50 on that, but I feel like it's just because it's the beginning of a series. I think it'll continue to draw me in as the series goes on, so would highly recommend checking this one out if you haven't already. Okay, I've talked enough for one video. This is gonna be very long on what we read. Those are all the books that we read recently for this video. And if you've read anything that we have talked about, we would love to hear what you thought, whether you agreed with us or disagreed with us. And we will see you guys for the next What We Read episode soon. Bye!